It's election day here in Australia, which is perfect for our topic, Cockups, Crackpots, and Conniptions. So many possible stories and examples in the political arena. Though I promise we won't talk about politics. Well, not much anyway. Let's do it. Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we look at leadership perspectives, where we want to build better cultures and inspire boundless leadership. So many great things to talk about here today. It's election day as I'm recording this, which is always a pretty exciting time, I reckon, because the future of the nation hangs on us doing our democratic duty. So by the time you listen to this, we'll know the result. In the meantime, I'm recording in suspension. So stay tuned for the results. I guess you already know them. Some updates from me. It's a very exciting time. I am about to step up and do some really new and innovative stuff in my practice. I'm working with my mentors, Matt Church and Peter Cook, and we're going to take my practice apart, look at where we want to up-level and expand. So my theme and focus for the next 3 years is going to be about growth and expansion. How can I serve more people to get them to become boundless leaders so that we can expand our perspective and do greater work in the world? So yeah, lots of exciting things coming up in my practice that you can be part of. In terms of immediate stuff, though, we've got the CEO's Not-for-Profits Roundtable Breakfast coming up on the 30th of May. And it's your chance, if that's you, if you're a CEO of a for-purpose business, to come along and meet other CEOs and have intimate, private, confidential conversations about the issues that really matter. And this month, we're talking about culture in the for-purpose sector. And having worked in 3 different not-for-profit or for-purpose businesses, I know how different corporate culture is in that environment. And there's very specific things that we need to keep in mind. But onwards to today's topic, Cockups, Crackpots, and Conniptions. Pretty good alliteration, I reckon. But there's lots of things that we need to have a look at here. And I think this tough stuff in leadership comes from some of these areas. Sometimes it's our stuff ups, sometimes it's other people's stuff ups. But the only way to cut through this drama is through perspective, because perspective gives us power. And I thought as a superpower, it's kind of like, perspective is kind of like X-ray vision. It helps you see right to the heart of the matter. On a side note, as a superpower, in generally, like X-ray vision, I always thought that's kind of creepy. Like, if you had X-ray vision like Superman, how much do you actually see? Do you see through people's clothes to their underpants? Do you see people naked, or does it just go straight to skeleton and flesh and all the biochemistry stuff that's underneath your skin? Anyway, that's perhaps an exploration for a different podcast, how far X-ray vision goes. When it comes to leadership, though, the more perspectives you have, the better you are at reading what's going on, and the better able you are to make sensible interventions and decisions that have a long-lasting positive effect. So, when it comes to cock-ups, though, how does that happen? By the way, what an excellent word. I think it's just fabulous. It's very visual, don't you think? Have you ever had a cock-up at work? Let's rephrase that. That was probably not a good visual prompt before going into that question. Let's rephrase. Have you ever stuffed up at work? Well, I certainly have. I'm going to tell you, just one of my stories. Years ago, when I started a new job, I was pretty excited. I was the new kid on the block. I had lots of experience to share, and I was keen to make a contribution. So I was ready and able to share my perspective on everything that was based on my knowledge. So I went around the country with my mentor, so the person I was taking over from, as an observer. The idea being that I could learn the process, learn how we did things around here. And I just couldn't help myself. I was eager to contribute. So I remember this on one occasion. My colleague was facilitating a session, a leadership training session, and I sat up at the back of the room with bated breath, listening to everything that was happening, going, oh, I have so much to offer here. And so I did. So from the back of the room, I added in things. I interjected and offered perspectives and solutions, and I thought was contributing to the whole. I felt pretty smug and happy about my contribution and felt like I had enough experience to make a difference to the group. Well, as you can imagine, or maybe you can't, but I certainly didn't. When the email came on the Monday after the week's training, it went something like this. Dear Zoe, comma, new paragraph. The way that you behaved on the program last week was incredibly unprofessional, full stop. Pretty harsh. New paragraph. The way that you interfered and interjected was extremely disruptive, full stop. I believe that it interfered with our professionalism and made us look like two-bit actors, full stop. New paragraph. If things continue in this way, I will be forced to cease and desist and no longer participate in this program as it is affecting my professional reputation. Full stop. Those weren't the exact words. That was the sentiment. I had behaved inappropriately and it had caused angst, let's put it that way, for the experienced facilitators. I was abashed, ashamed, frustrated, upset. There was no cue at all that I had done anything wrong. And I thought, well, this is terrible. To give feedback through email is pretty crappy. In any case, it's clearly that I had stuffed up. So I found out from the other facilitator, there was a third facilitator, what was going on, where was this coming from? And she was gracious enough to tell me that basically I needed to pull my head in and respect what was going on at the front of the room. Yeah, pretty embarrassing. All I wanted to do was offer something and contribute something, good intentions, zero awareness. So I apologized to my colleague and let it be known that in future observation sessions, I would be doing just that, observing. So this is the thing. If someone is gracious enough to give you feedback about how your behavior is having a negative impact, it's up to us to suck it up, embrace that feedback, and really explore it, because chances are there's a perspective we hadn't considered, and perspective is powerful. In this case, it gave me great insight into what not to do when you're learning on the job. Don't try and assert your authority and your expertise, because basically other people have something to offer too. It's better to be humble and to learn from your peers. So that's one of my Cockups, and that angst lasted for quite a while. Crackpots. I love that word too. Look, listen, there's a lot of crazy people out there. There are some real weirdos that we end up working with. But there's a certain type of weirdo that's weirder than others and more difficult to work with. The psychopath. Now, apparently not all psychopaths are violent crazies. Some of them just are successful psychopaths. Listen to this story about Tom Scahill that I read about. He was an Australian war hero from First World War, known as the blind soldier poet. And during World War I, Battle of Gallipoli, he was a flag signaler, one of the most dangerous of all positions, obviously, because he's signaling flags. You're an obvious target. He was blinded by a bombshell that was detonated at his feet, and he was transferred out. Following the war, he wrote a popular book of poetry about his combat experience, and he toured around Australia and the US, reciting his poetry to rapt audiences, the blind poet. Now, this is the thing. It was all bullshit. He wasn't blind at all. He had faked his blindness to escape danger. And this all came out after a drunken performance. He blamed his slurred speech, so he's trying to cover up his blurred speech from being drunk, on an unverifiable war injury. He claimed to have met Lenin and Mussolini. There's absolutely no evidence that he did. And he spoke of his extensive battle experience at Gallipoli when he'd been there for just 8 days and faked blinding to get out of it. This is an example of a psychopath. They can be extremely charismatic and persuasive and influential and have zero concerns about lying about all that stuff. How does this happen? I delved a little bit more into this and discovered some research by Queensland forensic psychologist Nathan Brooks. And by the way, I'll include this in the show notes at zoerouth.com/podcast/crackpots. I think that you should remember that tagline because it's such a good word, crackpots. Nathan Brooks, his research showed that when he studied the traits of corporate leaders, and this is kind of scary, he found that between 3 and 21% of them display psychopathic traits. That's a lot, right? Up to 20% of corporate leaders have psychopathic traits. He said they looked at 1,000 people, which involved 261 corporate professionals, and that sector was the most interesting. He found that 1 in 5 people were found to be clinically elevated levels of psychopathy. think that's how you pronounce it. And it's similar to shared similarities to what we'd find in a prison population. In other words, 1 in 5 chief executives are psychopaths. And they appear more in certain professional niches like politics. It sounds familiar, right? Thinking about psychopaths. Business, law enforcement, firefighting, special ops, and high-risk sports. So what is a psychopath? Let's have a look at their characteristics. They're charming, aggressive, and looking out for number one. They're like the lone wolf, but they can charm the pants off you. They have great social poise, charisma, audacity, and adventurousness. They are primed for boldness, and they have impulsive, heroic behaviors. They have egocentricity and shallow emotional states. So basically, they care about themselves. They're looking to manipulate you only for their own good, and they don't care how you feel. I had a look at this other book that came out called Snakes in Suits by Richard Hare and Paul Babiak. Again, this will be in the show notes at zoerouth.com/podcast/crackpots. And what they found in their research about successful psychopaths at work is that they have this sort of pattern. First of all, they go through an assessment of what's going on in the workplace. And then they figure out who they can use. And then they start the manipulation of building relationships and manipulating people for their own good. And then they go to the abandonment phase. So they come on scene, they scope out who's going to be useful to them, they charm them up, get what they want, and get rid of them, or get rid of the relationship. And in their relationships, they have pawns, people they just use, patrons, so people with positional influence or authority that they suck up to, who they charm. And so the patrons are like, wow, this is a superstar, I'll look after them. They get promoted. And what happens is after the promotion, sometimes the psychopath will then backstab their patron and get rid of them. And so the patrons become patsies. I'm wondering if this is resonating with your experience. So in the interpersonal domain, psychopaths are superficial, deceitful, and grandiose. It's quite scary, really. I can think about many people I've experienced with these traits. In the emotional world, they lack empathy, remorse, and the ability to take any responsibility for their actions. That's the scariest part, lacking empathy. They just do not care about other people's feelings. They understand that people have feelings, and yet what they see is that that's an opportunity to manipulate them to get what they want. They tend to lack life goals and can act in a very irresponsible and impulsive way in general. There's no fear of consequences, really. And in the antisocial domain, sometimes they have a history of lacking behavioral control, so they can lash out at people and so on. Sometimes this is observed as delinquency in adolescence and adulthood. So there's some interesting brain science that goes behind all of this. There's a genetic predisposition to an undeveloped limbic system. Your limbic system is your emotional control center. So if it's underdeveloped, that shows why people don't have proper risk assessment strategies or empathy. And I think that's the biggest interesting thing. If you have an undeveloped limbic system, it's hard for you to have compassion. You might have, as a psychopath, warrior, can't even pronounce it, warrior genes, i.e. primed to attack. So these were associated with serotonin, and if you had a warrior gene, you were primed to be at risk for aggression, violence, and low emotional and interpersonal empathy. So if you have warrior gene, you have an underdeveloped limbic system and more prone to being aggressive with low empathy. And if you're raised in an abusive environment, this kind of accentuates those character traits. However, they found the research, if you're raised in a positive environment, this can have a mitigating effect on it. So that you might become less antisocial and successful, in quotation marks, in the corporate world. So you don't default to violence and end up in jail, but you're just as corrosive, I guess. So this is what we can think about in terms of leadership when it comes to dealing with psychopaths, assuming we're not one, you're not one listening to this. If you're dealing with a psychopath, whether it's a leader or a colleague at work, if you share your perspective about how their behavior is affecting others, sometimes that can help rein them in. They may not give a crap about how other people are feeling, and yet if you couch your perspective in terms of how it's affecting their success, you have a good chance at encouraging to rein in their behavior. Because after all, they're out for number one. So if you say, if you do this, then this is a consequence and you'll be unsuccessful, they'll be more motivated to be better behaved. It may not be sincere better behavior, but it's less abusive in some ways. So the idea here is speaking up with your perspective is always incredibly powerful, particularly when it comes to psychopaths. Now, the third aspect of challenging work situations we're talking about today is conniptions. When you lose the plot, or rather, I'm going to tell a story about when I lost the plot. Psychopaths and other crazies can really drive us to the wall. And we can end up losing our cool and having our own reputational damage and fallout. This is, however, dealing with psychopaths is often the exception rather than the rule. So let me tell you about this experience I had a few years ago. I was it was about the time when I was a new staff member, and I wanted to impress. And what happened was I made a few mistakes because I didn't know all the systems. So I tread on a few people's toes. And when it came to, I was meant to offer some information to the chairman who was coming to do a presentation with the board. And apparently, I barely recall the actualities, but I do remember the repercussions. I think I had to give some particular information to the chairman, but instead of going through the EA, I went straight to the chair. And the chair got frustrated with this because they were a very busy person across many different boards, and why were they dealing directly with a staff member? This feedback got filtered back to the organization, and my local psychopath, well, I don't think she was a psychopath. She was a bit of a manipulator. She found out, my colleague, and she was sure to tell me. And she was an interesting person. Let's call her Rebecca. Rebecca was, she loves drama. Let's put it that way. She's a drama queen. She doesn't exaggerate, but she likes to create drama. So she saw here an opportunity with a new staff member ready to please, making mistakes as an opportunity to create drama. So she was sure to come and tell me how upset the chair was and that I needed to make rectification of this and not do anything out of the ordinary again. And I was to submit all correspondence through her to the EA and so on. So she basically put me in my place, which, as you can imagine, that was a little bit upsetting to me, that I had inadvertently caused so much chaos and upsettedness for people with positional authority. So that was the first incident. And then there was a number of other incidents where I kept stuffing up, like little things, just not knowing about procedures and protocols, and I got the feedback. And then the major incident happened. She came mincing down the hallway. Actually, she didn't really mince. She was a stomper. She was a stomper and a sire. So you go stomp, stomp, stomp down the hallway. And then occasionally you hear her in the office. So she made her presence known, whether it was through stomping or sighing. And you kind of always, or at least I was, always on the back foot worrying about this. So stomp, stomp, stomp. And then she came into where I was sitting and placed in front of me one of the pieces of material I'd been working on, a brochure, if I recall. And she said, "What do you think about that?" I said, "Yep, that's the brochure. Just had them printed." And she said, "Have a look at the front picture." I'm like, "Yeah, it's fine. What about it?" And she said, "It's the wrong picture. It's from last year's group, not this year's group." And I looked again, and to my horror, she was right. I'd actually submitted the wrong darn picture for this brochure. They were completely useless. It was meant to showcase that year's group, and I'd gotten the wrong damn picture. I was mortified. This had become after a series of little mistakes and mishaps, and here was another one. And this one was going to cost us a lot of money. Well, in my mind, it was a lot of money. It was a huge waste, $1,500 to get them all redone and reprinted. And that was it for me. I went into basically a conniption. It's the first and only time I have ever stamped my foot and slammed the door. I was pushed to the edge. I had a little meltdown, basically. And as this happened, the door slammed. I stopped to myself. I thought, who am I? Who am I to stamp the foot and slam the door? What kind of behavior is this? How did it get to this way? And I realized I had been played. I'd been played by the drama queen. And Rebecca, after I had this little meltdown, she said, "Don't worry, I'll fix it." And with this little sly grin, she picked up the brochure and she didn't stomp. She then did mince down the hallway because she got to play hero and solve it while I had basically a little emotional crisis. So not only did she spot the mistake before it became disastrous, but she could save the day, all at my expense. Wow. So how did I let myself get so manipulated to lose control? Here's the thing. We need to stop worrying about what other people think and start learning forward. I wasn't going to beat myself out forever about losing my control, though I did apologize to my colleague. Irrespective of the fact that she was playing me and hooking me, it's still my responsibility to show up calm and centered. So I thought about it and I thought, okay, what can I learn from this? And I decided to learn the systems basically and to focus on not being played and to show up with responsibility and be attuned to the people who would cause drama and to save my bacon a little bit down the traps. So if you find yourself in a cockup or being manipulated by a crackpot or in the tailspin of a conniption, reach out for a new perspective, one that is more empowering for you. Perspective, you see, is a gateway to compassion. And compassion, it helps us lead with love. What we want to do is lead with love and wisdom. So compassion for others and ourselves so we can see where we're coming from, and the wisdom to take right action and make amends and make better decisions. And that's the kind of change that we want to see in the world. So I'd love to hear your stories on Cockups, Crackpots, and Conniptions. Feel free to email me, zoe@innercompass.com.au. If you like this podcast, feel free to rate it. That would be awesome. In the meantime, live well, lead well.